A man in white linen counts grain that could feed a continent. His fingers move slowly through the kernels, the way a person touches something they once thought they would never see again. He's not smiling. He is remembering. Behind him, storehouses stretch farther than the eye can follow. Walls of mud brick and quarried stone, holding back 7 years of harvest against 7 years that have not yet arrived. Scribes move along the granary rows with reed pens and papyrus tallies, recording numbers that will decide whether entire regions eat or starve when the sky eventually stops giving rain. The man is 30 years old. Egypt calls him Zaphanath-Paneah now, a name given to him by a king, in a language that was not his own, in a country he did not choose. Some scholars translate that Egyptian name as Revealer of Secrets. Others read it as the God speaks, and he lives. Either translation fits a man who once knew what it meant to be silenced completely. Look closer at the storehouse itself. This is not a single building, but a network. Regional granaries positioned across the kingdom, each one filled during years when grain was so abundant it stopped being worth counting precisely, according to the record. Egypt's entire economic survival for the coming decade rests on decisions this one man is making tonight. Decisions built entirely out of 13 years most people would call wasted. But there was another name, given first, in another country, by a father who loved him too visibly for his own good. 13 years stand between the boy who wore that name and the man standing in this storehouse tonight. 13 years is not a short season of hardship. It is nearly half the life he has lived so far. This is where the story ends. Now we go back to where it began, to a hillside, a well, and a coat that was never meant to cause this much damage. The famine that surrounds this storehouse tonight will eventually be recorded in later tradition as one of the defining catastrophes of the ancient Near East, severe enough to push entire families out of Canaan and into Egypt in search of grain that no longer grew anywhere else in the region. Everything that happens in the years ahead of this scene is shaped by the fact that one man, sold for silver as a teenager, happened to be standing exactly where he was needed when the sky finally stopped giving rain. His name was Yosef, he will add. That is what the Hebrew means. A name spoken over a mother who had waited years, through disappointment after disappointment, to finally hear it. He was 17. He wore a coat his father had made for no one else, in a family where everyone noticed exactly what wasn't shared equally. Some traditions describe that coat as a long tunic reaching to the palms and soles, with sleeves, the kind of garment worn by someone who did not do manual labor, not the kind worn by a working shepherd. If that reading is accurate, the coat was not only a gift, it was a public statement about who would not have to get their hands dirty, worn in plain sight of brothers who did that work every single day. He dreamed and made the mistake every 17-year-old makes at some point. He told the dream out loud to the very people it would hurt the most. Genesis 37 records 11 brothers who watched him coming from a distance in the hill country near Dothan and decided, before he even arrived, exactly what they were going to do. This is Canaan in the 2nd millennium before Christ, a land of shepherds, disputes, tribal alliances, and family loyalty that ran only as deep as favoritism allowed it to run. Small fortified towns dotted the hill country, surrounded by seasonal pasture that shifted with the rains, forcing families like Jacob's to move their flocks across considerable distances throughout the year in search of adequate grazing land. Water rights in this region were not a minor concern. Wells were dug at enormous cost in labor, often disputed for generations between neighboring clans, as earlier chapters of Genesis already record between Isaac's household and the Philistines further south. A family's wealth was measured as much in access to water and grazing land as it was in the actual size of its flocks. Jacob's household was not poor. Flocks numbering in the hundreds, servants, land rights passed down through Isaac and Abraham before him, going all the way back to a promise made at Bethel about descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. Wealth that should have made brothers into allies instead made them into accountants of each other's worth. Who received more, who was trusted more, whose word carried weight at the evening fire. The pasture land near Shechem and Dothan was some of the richest grazing land in the region, which is precisely why the brothers had traveled so far from home in the first place. Distance from their father meant distance from his eyes, and distance from his eyes meant room to finally settle an old account that had been building for years. Here is the first sign the viewer sees before Joseph does. His brothers no longer call him by name. In the text, they call him this dreamer. A person becomes a label right before they become a victim of it. Here is the second sign. Reuben, the oldest, suggests the pit instead of murder, not entirely from love, but from calculation, from the weight of being the firstborn who would personally answer to Jacob if a body were ever found. He plans to come back later, alone, and quietly pull Joseph out himself. The rescue is real, but it is also silent, unannounced to the others, the kind of good intention that arrives a few hours too late to matter at all. Here is the third sign. A caravan is already visible on the road before the brothers even finish arguing among themselves. Genesis 37:25 places Ishmaelite and Midianite traders moving from Gilead toward Egypt, carrying balm, spice, and myrrh. A normal commercial route on a normal afternoon, about to carry something else entirely. The road these traders walked was not incidental to the story. It was part of an established trade network, connecting Gilead's spice-growing highlands to the markets of the Nile Delta, a corridor merchants used constantly for resin, balm, and aromatic gum destined for Egyptian embalming workshops and perfume houses. This is exactly why Joseph's brothers knew, without needing to discuss it aloud, precisely what to do the moment they saw dust rising on the horizon. Judah is the one who names the price out loud, not out of simple cruelty in his own reasoning, but out of a strange, twisted mercy. Better to sell their brother for silver than to have his blood directly on their hands and carry that weight home to their father. It is the kind of logic people invent when they want to feel less guilty about something they have already fully decided to do. Joseph is stripped of the coat first, not beaten in that moment, not silenced by force, just undressed of the one object that made him visibly, undeniably loved above the others. Then he is lowered into a pit, dry enough to hold him, empty enough that no one has to listen to him cry out for very long. The pits scattered across that region were originally dug as cisterns, carved into porous limestone to catch the rare seasonal rainfall and store water through the long, dry months of summer. Empty of water in a drought season, they became something else entirely. A convenient place to store a person the way you might store an inconvenient piece of livestock until a buyer happened to arrive. Genesis records, almost in passing, that the brothers sat down to eat a meal within earshot of the pit. That single detail, eating calmly while their brother's voice rose out of the darkness below them, is one of the most disturbing lines in the entire chapter, and the text never softens it. The transaction itself happens quickly, almost administratively, the way people move fast through decisions they do not want to examine too closely. 20 shekels of silver change hands, weighed out rather than counted, since coinage as we know it did not yet exist in this period. Payment measured instead on a balance scale, piece by piece, the ordinary way any livestock or goods might be purchased along that same trade route on any other day. It is worth pausing on what 20 shekels actually represented in that economy. It was roughly the price of an ordinary laborer's wages for close to 2 years of work. Not a fortune by any measure, but not a trivial sum either. Enough to divide unevenly among 10 brothers, and still walk away feeling the transaction had been worthwhile. Enough, in other words, for a family to price a person somewhere between disposable and valuable, and land on the lower end of that scale without much internal debate. Reuben returns to the pit sometime later, apparently unaware the transaction has already taken place, and finds it empty. Genesis says he tears his own clothes in grief, the traditional gesture of mourning in that culture, and asks his brothers, almost helplessly, where he can possibly go now that the boy is gone. It is a small, human detail. The oldest brother, meant to be responsible for all of them, discovering that responsibility had already slipped out of his hands while he was elsewhere. To cover the story, the brothers slaughter a goat and dip Joseph's coat in its blood, then carry it home to their father and let him draw his own conclusion. They do not lie outright. They simply present evidence and let Jacob's grief do the rest of the work for them. Jacob tears his own garments, puts on sackcloth, and mourns for many days, refusing every attempt at comfort from his remaining sons and daughters, insisting he will go down to the grave mourning his son. The brothers who caused this grief now sit at the same table as the man they have broken, watching him grieve a lie they manufactured themselves. He had been the son who noticed things, not spoiled exactly, attentive. The one who reported when a shepherd cheated on the flock count, the one who remembered every dream his father ever mentioned at the evening fire, and asked, with real curiosity rather than flattery, what they might mean. In an earlier season, before the pit, before any of this, Jacob had pulled him aside near Hebron and told him, half laughing, half serious, that a man who dreams that clearly is either a fool or a prophet, and only time would tell which one he truly was. Joseph had believed, simply and without irony, that being loved and being chosen were the same category of thing. That was his innocence. It was also, eventually, his education. He remembered his mother, Rachel, who had died giving birth to his younger brother Benjamin on the road near Bethlehem, buried under a pillar his father set up, and never stopped visiting in memory. A grief Jacob never spoke about out loud, but never fully recovered from either. Joseph had grown up, without ever being told directly, as the living reminder of a loss no one discussed at dinner. And perhaps that is part of why his father could not stop looking at him. This is a boy who had never once had to survive purely on his own competence. Every advantage he carried, the coat, the favor, the seat closest to his father at the fire, had been given to him, not earned by him through any labor of his own. He remembered, too, the 2 dreams he had told without thinking twice. Sheaves of wheat in a harvest field bowing low to his own sheaf, and then, weeks later, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to him in the night sky. His father had rebuked him sharply for the second dream in front of all the brothers, asking whether the whole family would truly one day bow to the ground before him. But Genesis adds a small, important detail afterward. Jacob kept the matter in mind. Somewhere underneath the public anger, his father had quietly wondered if it might be true. The brothers understood that resentment in a very different way than Jacob ever did. It is, in part, why the punishment felt to them like justice rather than cruelty. They were not only removing a rival for their father's affection, they were forcing a soft, protected life to finally become as hard as their own already was. What none of them accounted for, what none of them could possibly have accounted for, was that the boy carried something underneath the favoritism that had nothing to do with Jacob's love at all. A capacity for order, for interpretation, for seeing patterns that other people consistently missed entirely. They thought they were selling a spoiled child for 20 pieces of silver. the standard market price, reflected later in Levitical law, for a young male slave of roughly his age. They were, without knowing it, selling the future administrator of the most sophisticated grain economy in the ancient world. There is something almost unbearable about that gap between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing. 10 grown men standing over a pit, negotiating a price for their own brother as though he were a lamb that had wandered from the flock, with absolutely no sense that history itself was quietly turning on the decision they were making that particular afternoon. Most of the worst moments in any family's story look exactly like this from the inside. Ordinary, almost boring in their cruelty. No thunder in the sky to mark the occasion. Just tired men making a convenient decision because the alternative required more courage than any of them had that day. He remembered the last thing he saw of home, not his father's face, which he never got the chance to say goodbye to, but the shape of the hills around Hebron shrinking slowly behind him as the caravan moved south, toward a country whose language he did not yet speak, and whose gods he did not recognize. He remembered, too, that Reuben came back to the pit alone, and tore his own clothes when he found it empty, and said to no one in particular that the child was gone, and asked, almost helplessly, where he himself could go now. Joseph never heard those words. He only ever learned of them decades later, and by then, they changed very little. There is a broader family history sitting underneath all of this that the brothers themselves would have known well. Their grandfather Isaac had also favored one son's blessing in a way that fractured a family for decades. Their great-grandfather Abraham had sent away his own firstborn son, Ishmael, into the wilderness at his wife's insistence. Favoritism, rivalry, and the pain of a father who could not seem to love his children equally were not new patterns in this family. They were, by this point, almost inherited traits, passed down the way land and flocks were passed down, generation after generation, each one absorbing the wound of the one before it without ever fully naming it. Joseph did not invent the dysfunction he was born into. He simply became its most visible casualty. In the same hill country where his own father had once fled a brother's anger, and his own grandfather had once nearly lost a son to a very different kind of sacrifice, on a mountain not far from here. He remembered the 12 tribes as they existed before this: Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, the sons of Leah, older and harder, carrying their own private resentment at watching Rachel's late-born son receive attention their own mother never fully received from Jacob. He remembered Dan and Naphtali, sons of Bilhah. He remembered Gad and Asher, sons of Zilpah. A household of 4 different mothers under one roof, each set of sons aware, in ways children always are, of exactly where they ranked in a hierarchy no one stated out loud, but everyone understood perfectly. That structure alone, polygamous households competing for a single patriarch's attention and inheritance, was common enough in the period, reflected across other patriarchal narratives in Genesis. But common does not mean painless. It meant Joseph grew up inside a competition he never asked to enter, wearing a coat that publicly declared him the winner of a contest his brothers had been losing since before he could talk. Egypt does not receive him gently. He is purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. And for a while, something almost good happens to him. Genesis 39 says plainly that the Lord was with Joseph, and that Potiphar noticed it and gave him charge over the entire household, a slave running an Egyptian estate, because his competence was simply impossible to ignore, even by a man who owed him nothing at all. Egyptian households of this class operated as small economies in themselves. Granaries, textile workshops, brewing operations, livestock, dozens of servants and laborers under one authority. To be placed over all of it as foreign-born property was not a small trust. In practical terms, it was everything short of freedom itself. This is the first identification scene, a meal in Potiphar's house, where Joseph eats separately from the Egyptians at the table. Genesis 43 later confirms that Egyptians would not eat bread together with Hebrews, considering it something detestable to their customs. And Joseph understands quietly, in that separate seating arrangement, that competence will earn him real authority in this house, but never full belonging within it. Then Potiphar's wife begins to look at him the way his brothers once refused to look at him at all, not with resentment, but with a different kind of hunger that is, in its own way, just as dangerous to a man with no protector. She asks. He refuses. She asks again, day after day, according to the text. Not once, but as a sustained pattern, an accumulation of quiet pressure aimed at a young man with no family to call for help, no elder to consult, no legal standing of any kind in a foreign country that was not his own. There is an economic logic underneath this entire episode that rarely gets mentioned. Joseph, as chief steward, would have had direct authority over the household's finances, its supply contracts, its record-keeping, the exact skill set that made him indispensable to Potiphar, and later indispensable to an entire nation. Potiphar's wife was not propositioning an ordinary servant. She was attempting to compromise the one person whose absolute integrity was the reason the household ran as smoothly and profitably as it did. Everything Joseph had built for 2 years rested on a reputation for trustworthiness, the very quality now being used as leverage against him in a room with no witnesses. This is the second identification scene, the private conversation, where the real issue is never actually said aloud between them. Joseph does not say, "I am afraid of what happens to me if I refuse you." He says instead a careful sentence about his master's trust and about sinning against God, a technical, guarded answer that avoids naming the actual danger sitting in the room across from him. I cannot do this thing. Why not? Because it is not mine to take. Everything in this house has been placed in my hand, except you, because you are his wife. No one would ever know. Someone already does. She does not accept careful answers forever. Genesis notes this pressure continuing day after day, until one particular afternoon, alone in the house with no other servants present, she catches his garment as he turns and runs from the room rather than stay another moment. This is the third identification scene. Public expectation colliding directly with private truth. Potiphar's wife holds the garment in her hands and tells a story that will be believed before Joseph ever has the chance to open his mouth in his own defense. Because in that house, in that century, his word as a foreign slave was worth far less than her accusation by simple, cruel default. There is no scene in the text where Joseph is given the opportunity to explain himself directly to Potiphar. No trial, no hearing, no moment where his side of events is weighed against hers. The silence around his own defense is as loud, in its own way, as anything he actually says elsewhere in the story. A man whose voice, twice now, has been rendered irrelevant to a verdict already decided by someone else. She tells the story twice, in fact. Once to the household servants, framing herself as the victim of a Hebrew man's advances, and again to Potiphar himself when he returns home, using nearly identical language both times, as if she had rehearsed it in the space between. Notice too what she keeps as evidence: his garment, left behind in her hand when he fled the room. Genesis is precise about this detail because it mirrors, almost exactly, an earlier moment in Joseph's own story. A garment stripped from him and used as false evidence against him once already by his own brothers, when a blood-stained coat convinced his father of a lie. Twice now, an article of clothing becomes the physical proof of a story that never actually happened. And twice now, Joseph has no ability to correct the record once it starts moving. He isn't executed. Genesis is careful about that specific detail. Potiphar's anger is real and immediate, but restrained, almost as if some part of him doubted the story, even while enforcing its consequence anyway. Joseph is sent to the king's prison instead of to the executioner, a specific building reserved, according to the text, for the king's own prisoners. The favor he had spent 2 full years building is erased in a single afternoon by a lie he did nothing at all to invite or deserve. Egyptian legal custom of the period gave a master near total authority over a slave's fate, without appeal, without outside witness, without formal process of any kind. That Joseph was imprisoned rather than killed outright is, in itself, a detail worth pausing on. A small, strange mercy folded inside an enormous injustice that would have ended most stories right there. He walks into that prison, still wearing the confusion of a man who did the right thing. Twice now, and lost everything for it anyway. Both times. Consider the arithmetic of it plainly. 17 years old, sold by his own family. Somewhere near 28, betrayed by the household he had faithfully served for over a decade. In both cases, Joseph is the person acting with integrity, refusing to harm his brothers when he had the excuse of their own cruelty, refusing to betray his master's trust when he had every incentive and opportunity to give in. And in both cases, integrity is precisely what costs him everything he has built. That pattern alone is worth sitting with, because it is rarely how these stories are told. Faithfulness in Scripture does not always lead immediately to blessing. Sometimes, for a long season, it leads directly to a cell. The Egyptian prison system of this era was not designed for rehabilitation. It functioned largely as a holding facility for political prisoners, foreign captives, and those awaiting royal judgment, men whose fate depended entirely on the whims of a king they might never actually meet. For a foreign slave with no advocate and no legal standing, a sentence here could easily have become permanent. A life sentence with no formal end date attached to it at all. No dialogue here. Only what is left when the door closes behind him. Stone against his back, cold that does not care what he did or did not do to deserve it. He does not scream. He has already learned, twice now, that screaming changes absolutely nothing. I was good in that house. I was still taken from it. His hands remember work, measuring grain, managing accounts, giving instructions to servants twice his own age. Now they hold nothing at all. The air smells of river damp and old grain sacks stacked against the far wall. And somewhere above, faintly, the sound of the city continuing without him, indifferent to his absence. That was the moment something inside him that had always believed finally stopped. Not faith exactly. Something smaller and more fragile than faith. The quiet, almost childlike assumption that goodness gets noticed eventually. That effort gets rewarded in time. That being right protects a person from the very worst outcomes life can offer. He watches a single crack of light on the wall move, hour by hour, and understands that this, not the sun, not the changing seasons, is now his only measurement of time passing. His breath slows. His shoulders drop lower than ordinary exhaustion alone requires. Somewhere above him, Egypt continues exactly as it did yesterday, exactly as it will again tomorrow, entirely indifferent to the fact that a man is quietly disappearing inside it. No one outside this room knows his name today. No one outside this room will know it tomorrow either, or the day after that. Genesis 40 places 2 new prisoners beside him, Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's baker, both fallen suddenly from the very palace that Joseph will one day help govern from the inside. The prison Joseph occupied is described in the text as being under the authority of the captain of the guard, very likely Potiphar himself. An irony the narrative never comments on directly, but never hides either. Joseph's own accuser may well have remained, indirectly, his jailer, for years afterward. First moment of collapse. He cannot eat properly for days after the two officials arrive. His stomach tightened by a fragile hope he does not want to feel again, in case it is taken from him a third time in a row. He interprets both of their dreams accurately within the same short conversation. 3 vine branches for the cupbearer, meaning restoration to his position within 3 days. 3 baskets of bread for the baker, meaning execution within the same 3 days. He asks only one thing in return for the accuracy of what he has told them. One thing that costs him nothing to ask and everything to hope for. When it is well with you, remember me. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this place. For I was taken from the land of the Hebrews, and here too I have done nothing to deserve this prison. This is the almost surrender moment of the entire arc. An old comfort appears unexpectedly. A real door, a genuine chance, a man about to walk free who will now personally owe Joseph his own life and position. He lets himself hope, cautiously, against his own better judgment, built from 2 previous betrayals. The viewer must feel exactly how much that hope costs a person who has already been disappointed twice before, by people who should have protected him both times. Second moment of collapse. The quiet social shame of being a foreign slave, explaining his own innocence to men who hold real power and genuinely owe him nothing beyond a spoken promise made in a dark cell. Genesis 40:23 delivers the third collapse without softening a single word of it. The cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him completely. The moment wine was back in his own hand, and his old life resumed exactly where it had left off. Third moment of collapse. The slow erosion of watching seasons change through a narrow window slit, aging quietly in a cell, while a promise given to him directly, by name, simply evaporates into someone else's convenience and comfort and forgetting. His imperfect support figure in this entire block is no person at all. It is the apparent silence of God himself, which Genesis doesn't explain away or excuse during these 2 additional years of waiting. The text offers Joseph no comfort here, no vision, no angel, no word. It only offers him time. That absence of comfort is itself the loneliest detail in the whole narrative. Not that people failed him, which he had already come to expect by now, but that even the God he had trusted since childhood said nothing at all for 2 more full years. 2 full years, the text specifies exactly, in Genesis 41:1. Not a season, not a matter of a few difficult weeks. 2 years of a name spoken once in gratitude, and then left to gather dust in a palace that had already, quietly and completely, moved on with its own business. He learns, in that particular silence, something most people spend an entire lifetime trying to avoid learning: that being forgotten by someone who owes you everything is a specific, particular kind of pain, different from betrayal, different from simple injustice, the quiet pain of simply not mattering enough to anyone to be remembered. Consider what those 2 years actually contain, day by day, for a man with nothing left to occupy him but waiting. No task large enough to distract him, the way managing Potiphar's estate once did. No dream to interpret, no crisis to solve, only the same 4 walls and the same narrow strip of light moving slowly across them, morning after morning, for 730 individual days that Genesis compresses into a single verse and a single, devastating word: forgotten. There is no record of Joseph raging against God during these 2 years. There is no recorded prayer of protest, no recorded accusation, No dramatic wrestling match the way his grandfather Jacob once wrestled through a night at Peniel. Genesis simply goes quiet about his internal life during this stretch of time, and that silence in the text mirrors the silence Joseph himself experiences from heaven. Sometimes the most honest way to portray faith under pressure is not a triumphant declaration of trust, but simply the fact of continuing to exist day after day, without an explanation, without a sign, without any evidence that the waiting will ever end. Egyptian dream interpretation at the time was considered a specialized craft belonging to trained priests and scribes who consulted written manuals of established symbols, passed down and studied for years. Joseph's approach was entirely different and entirely without institutional backing. He gave credit immediately to a foreign god the Egyptians did not worship, in a system that had no category at all for a slave succeeding where trained professionals had already failed. That detail alone would have marked him as either dangerously arrogant or genuinely, undeniably gifted. And for 2 more years, no one in power stopped long enough to find out which. The specific symbolism inside each dream is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals how closely tied to ordinary economic life these images were. The cupbearer dreams of a vine with 3 branches budding, blossoming, and producing ripe grapes, which he presses into Pharaoh's cup, an image drawn directly from his own daily occupation, the exact task he performs each morning at the palace. The baker dreams of 3 baskets of bread on his head, with birds eating from the top basket, and gets no reassurance in return, only a countdown to an execution 3 days away. 2 men sharing a cell, sharing a set of circumstances, receiving completely different verdicts from the same set of days. An early, uncomfortable picture of a truth the whole book of Genesis keeps returning to. Proximity to someone else's blessing is not the same thing as receiving one yourself. Joseph delivers both interpretations in the same breath, the same tone, the same careful attention to detail, regardless of which man is about to celebrate and which is about to die. There is no recorded hesitation in his voice, no attempt to soften the baker's sentence or to curry extra favor with the cupbearer. He simply tells the truth as he understands it, to both men equally, in a cell where telling an inconvenient truth costs him nothing further to lose. The turning point is not glorious. It is a guard on one ordinary morning, remembering almost by accident that Pharaoh urgently needs someone who can properly interpret dreams, because Pharaoh has had 2 troubling dreams of his own. In one night that no priest or magician in all of Egypt can adequately explain, Joseph does not deliver a sermon before Pharaoh. He says one true, careful sentence, stripped of any self-promotion at all, before the most powerful man in the ancient world. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh the answer he needs. He interprets the dreams as 7 years of great abundance across the land, followed immediately by 7 years of severe famine that will consume all memory of the plenty before it. Then, still officially a prisoner, still officially nothing in the eyes of Egyptian society, he adds one more sentence Pharaoh never actually asked for: a concrete, practical plan. Store a 1/5 of the harvest during each of the good years. Appoint someone trustworthy and discerning to oversee the entire operation across the whole kingdom. Weeks later, he is bathed, shaved in the Egyptian style, a detail Genesis includes deliberately, since Egyptians shaved and Hebrews generally did not, marking a visible transition between 2 identities, and dressed for the first time in years, in clothing that genuinely belongs to him, instead of a role that has been forced onto him by other people. The day he receives Pharaoh's own signet ring, placed directly on his hand, he says nothing. There is nothing appropriate left to say after 13 years of exactly this kind of silence and waiting. 2 months after that, He oversees the first official measure of grain counted into the royal storehouses. A young man from Canaan, once sold for a stranger's silver on an ordinary afternoon, now setting economic policy for the most powerful nation on the entire earth. Egypt's grain administration under the Pharaohs was one of the earliest known examples of centralized state economic planning in human history. A coordinated system of scribes, granary officials, and regional overseers, tracking harvests across the full length of the Nile Valley, from the Delta to Upper Egypt. To be placed at the head of that entire system, as a foreigner and a former prisoner with no political allies of his own, was almost without precedent in the historical record of the period. Around this same time, Pharaoh gives Joseph an Egyptian wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, a priest of On, a marriage that fully integrates him, at least publicly, into the highest religious and social class of the country that once bought him as property. Their two sons carry names that tell their own quiet story. Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget my hardship, and Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Even in naming his own children, Joseph does not pretend the suffering did not happen. He names it directly and names what came after it as well. There is something instructive in the order of those two names. Manasseh, forgetting, comes first, born in the earliest relief of finally being safe, when the temptation to bury the entire ordeal and move forward without looking back would have been strongest. Ephraim, fruitfulness, comes second, once Joseph has had more time to sit with what actually happened to him, and can name the affliction directly by its proper word, rather than simply trying to forget it ever occurred. Healing, in this small detail buried inside two children's names, does not move in a straight line. It moves toward relief first, and only later toward the harder, more honest work of naming the wound plainly. The voice here is not triumphant. It is the voice of someone still learning, slowly and carefully, how to trust a good thing again without instinctively flinching away from it. Consider what Pharaoh actually hands him in that moment, beyond the ring itself. He receives the second chariot in the kingdom, a gold chain placed around his neck, and an announcement made ahead of him wherever he travels, requiring every person in his path to bow. 13 years earlier, that same gesture, bowing sheaves, bowing stars, had been the detail that made his own brothers want to destroy him. Now an entire nation performs the gesture voluntarily, and there is no recorded satisfaction in the text about the reversal at all. Only a man doing the work in front of him, one harvest season at a time, exactly as he had once managed a much smaller household for a man named Potiphar. The scale of the operation he now oversees is difficult to overstate. Regional granary officials across every district of Egypt would have reported to his administration, coordinating harvest yields, storage capacity, and distribution schedules across a territory spanning hundreds of miles along the Nile. This was not a symbolic promotion. It was operational command over the physical survival of an entire civilization, built on the same skill set, order, record-keeping, foresight, that had once made him valuable to a single Egyptian household, and, before that, useful to his own father's flocks in the hills above Hebron. Genesis specifies that during the 7 years of abundance, the grain gathered was measured like the sand of the sea, so vast that Joseph's scribes eventually stopped keeping precise count of it at all. This is, in effect, the first recorded strategic grain reserve in human history, a mechanism that would not only save Egypt, but would eventually draw people from surrounding nations, including his own family, across borders in search of food that existed nowhere else. The very system Joseph built out of 13 years of loss became the single reason an entire region survived a catastrophe severe enough to be remembered for generations afterward. He is 30 years old now, 13 years stand between the coat and the ring. Years no one can ever give back to him. Years that built, entirely without his permission, exactly the man Egypt would eventually need in its darkest season. The storehouses fill steadily during 7 years of plenty, exactly as he said they would. When the famine finally comes, severe enough that Genesis says it struck all the earth, it reaches Canaan too. Reaches the very brothers who once calculated his price by the edge of a dry pit and never thought of him again in the years since. 10 of those brothers travel down to Egypt to buy grain, making the same journey south that the Ishmaelite traders once made, carrying Joseph away from them, and stand before the second most powerful man in the country, without recognizing him at all. The beard shaved, the language changed, the boy they remembered now impossible to see in the official standing in front of them. Joseph recognizes them instantly. He says nothing of who he is, not yet, testing something in them across several tense encounters, watching to see if the brothers who once sold one sibling would now sacrifice another, his younger brother Benjamin, to save themselves. They do not. Judah, the same brother who once suggested selling Joseph for silver, offers his own life in exchange for Benjamin's freedom, unaware he is speaking directly to the person he wronged 13 years earlier. That offer alone breaks something open in Joseph that 13 years of silence had never managed to fully close. That reunion, when it finally comes, is not revenge. He does not humiliate the men who sold him into slavery all those years ago. Genesis 45 says he weeps so loudly that the whole household hears him, and even Pharaoh's own house hears the sound of it. 13 years of held breath released all at once, in front of the very people who caused it. He does not need their apology in order to be whole. He is already whole. That, more than the ring, more than the linen, more than the title Egypt gave him, is the actual restoration underneath the entire story. He tells them plainly not to be afraid, not to grieve over what they did, because God sent him ahead of them to preserve life. It is not a denial of what happened. It is a decision about what the suffering would be allowed to mean, made by the one person who had earned the right to make that decision. Notice what he does not say in that room. He does not say the pit was good, or that the false accusation was deserved, or that the 2 forgotten years in prison were somehow painless once you looked at the bigger picture. He says only that what they intended for evil, God intended for good, holding both truths in the same sentence without collapsing one into the other. The suffering was real. The purpose was also real. Joseph never asks his brothers, or himself, to pretend the first cancels out the second. Jacob is brought down to Egypt in his old age, reunited with the son he had mourned for 13 years, believing him dead, torn apart, never to be seen again. The family settles in Goshen, in the fertile eastern delta, given the best of the land by a pharaoh who owes his kingdom's survival to the very man once thrown away by his own brothers. There is a second reunion later that carries almost as much weight as the first. Jacob, now an old man, is told simply that Joseph is still alive and governs all of Egypt. And Genesis says his heart went numb because he did not believe it. Not until he saw the Egyptian wagons Joseph had sent to carry him, proof too physical and specific to be a rumor or a cruel joke played by grieving sons trying to comfort a dying father. When Jacob finally sees his son's face again, after 13 years of certainty that it was gone forever, he says he can die now, having seen with his own eyes that Joseph is still alive. That single sentence carries the entire emotional weight of everything that came before it. A father who spent over a decade believing the worst thing that could happen to a parent had already happened to him, discovering instead that the story was not finished, that the years he grieved were not the end of anything at all. Jacob had spent 13 years grieving a version of events his other sons manufactured for him, mourning a death that never actually happened, carrying a wound that turned out, all along, to be built on a lie. That, too, is part of the restoration this story eventually delivers. Not only Joseph recovering what was taken from him, but an old man finally released from a grief he never should have had to carry in the first place. 70 people in total make the journey down from Canaan into Egypt, according to the careful genealogical record Genesis preserves. An entire extended household relocating permanently into the region of Goshen, chosen deliberately because it was separated from the main population centers. Land suited for shepherds in a country where shepherding was considered a socially undesirable occupation among the Egyptians themselves. Even in prosperity, the family remains, quite literally, set apart in the same land where Joseph will govern for decades to come, watching that small clan of 70 grow over the following centuries into the beginnings of an entire nation. Tonight, in a country that once bought him like livestock on an open road, a man stands quietly over enough grain to keep his own family alive through the worst famine in living memory, and understands, finally and completely, that the pit was never the end of the story God was writing about him. If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments. I read every one,